thanks to all of you for sharing your insights today, and we're grateful to Deputy O'Reilly and Deputy MacDonald for developing this legislation. Unfortunately, in contrast to last week, the Minister for Children moved the Work-Life Balance Bill without any provisions for domestic violence leave, and he said he'll bring those in at committee stage, but that wouldn't allow us to discuss them properly or propose the potentially inevitable improvements required. So I don't agree that the Work-Life Balance Bill reflects the seriousness of the government's commitment to support people experiencing domestic violence. In fact, I think it reveals the opposite. The domestic leave component is an afterthought, and it's just not being professionally handled in that sense. Nonetheless, this bill is the focus for today, and I think we're all in agreement that victims and survivors of domestic violence are especially vulnerable, and leave specifically for this reason is important. It recognises the realities involved and helps people in desperate need. And the issue around IBEC has come up, I think, nearly in every contribution. And look, needless to say, I think it was embarrassing and it was a disgrace for them to come out with those comments. And I think we're all kind of in agreement that it's not relevant to the discussion that we're having here today. You know, we're not going to introduce anything along those lines. But I do think it actually speaks to a kind of broader issue that is relevant to today, in that people do not seem to have an understanding of domestic violence. For that suggestion to come out, even just I think people were wondering, like, what do they mean by prove it? And literally imagine, what do you turn up with? Visual injuries? Like, you know, I think it's important to highlight as well that some of the things that the witnesses said today, things like a private matter, we still see it as a private matter, not a public concern. I think that's very true. The focus on the victim and not the perpetrator, and despite the fact that domestic violence affects so many people, there just doesn't seem to be that awareness, that we had IBEC coming out and saying that. And I think that the discussion around the 5 days speaks to that problem as well. It's like we still don't seem to quite grasp the reality of what it's like for somebody leaving domestic violence. And, you know, I've encountered it with, say, people when they're fleeing domestic violence going to the local authority in need of emergency accommodation and then being asked to prove that they're homeless. And if you've just left a violent situation, you've got your children, your bags, potentially your pets, whatever with you, it's not possible, you know, to prove that. And people being met with that kind of hostility very often results in people returning to those violent situations because they feel they've got nowhere else to go. And I think, you know, we've had witnesses before this committee, and one of the ones I just want to rewind to for a moment is Marie Mulholland, who came to speak to us from the West Cork Women Against Domestic Violence Centre, and she highlighted the kind of unique barriers that women face in rural areas when they're fleeing domestic violence, and, you know, the court days, trying to get the safety orders, all the different things. Like, it's not like a neat 5 days, and the 5 days don't necessarily come like one after the other. And we also have to take into consideration that people are often making the transition then into single parenting. So things like managing school runs, other extracurricular activities, like 5 days isn't just really going to cut it, I think, in all reality. So I just want to start with that. But my questions, I have a few. First, for Professor Nata Javeri, you outlined the role of other reasonable accommodations like flexible working, support to seek protection orders, clear safety measures to maintain confidentiality and privacy as being key comprehensive domestic violence leave legislation. So I just wonder if you could elaborate on the importance of the kind of suite of measures that we might need to look at. And in your briefing document, you outlined larger issues that surround this type of leave, such as lack of awareness, or survivors may not be able to take leave because of feeling like of an insecurity around losing their job. Could you just share maybe some more insights from your research or other jurisdictions that could help address those issues? And your briefing paper also referred to protection for workers from their abusers while they're in the workplace. I just wonder if you could outline what that would involve, and are there examples from other jurisdictions that we might be able to look at? And for Ms. Mandy Lacombe, we know that the labour market traditionally has been a hostile place for women, with lots of ingrained malpractices and cultures that still remain. It's not that long ago that women had to leave work just when they simply got married. So in what material ways do you think domestic violence holds working women back today? And you rightly highlight how leave should be part of a broader domestic violence and work policy that would also support survivors in other ways. I just wonder if you could expand on that point and give examples of those supports to the committee.
Okay, there's a number of questions there. I think we'll start with Dr. Nata and then Mandy, and then if anybody else wants to come in, of course.
In terms of the suite of other measures or reasonable accommodations, leave is one element, but then you really need flexible working arrangements. And so this has been something that has been tested in some of the other legislations, like New Zealand has flexible working arrangements is also articulated. And that if a woman experiencing domestic violence requests flexible working arrangement, that this is something that the employer must try to do. This is also, interestingly, an element in a lot of state-level policies in the United States. As you know, the US has no federal legislation on domestic violence. Everything is under the Family and Medical Leave Act. But at the state level, there are many states that have specific domestic violence leave measures. And so there they have articulated the importance of ensuring flexible working arrangements are possible. A domestic violence survivor can request, and that this request must be seriously considered by the employer. Financial support is something that is also very, very important. And this has been actually very well articulated in Vodafone's policy and in some of the businesses that have had domestic violence leave policies, where they have either given loans for accommodation or for meeting the costs of moving, etc. And it can be a loan, it can be a grant, it can be any kind of financial assistance. The third is actually, and this is it come from the US, that actually employers supporting women to get safety orders for harassment by the perpetrator at the workplace. Because we know majority of women who experience domestic violence, the act of violence doesn't stop only at the home. It does travel to the work. It goes from home to, or the travel to the office. So where employers have seen their employees being killed at the workplace, it has created a great concern that employers can play a role in seeking protection orders for employees. So it has to be then worked out with either giving support for the women to go seek employment protection order. It may be reaching out to services that help the women to get protection order, that employers also need to interact and have a vast referral network to other services. So these are some of the other accommodations. Then in terms of this, what was the other question? I'm sorry. You had...
The second question was on...
Protection order, it's in the US. There are cases, which I can send you, of where employers have worked with the women to give them access to help support to file for protection orders in the court. So it's not just going through domestic violence agencies, but the employer having lawyers that help women to file for protection orders.
And there was just, the middle question was on that people may not take leave because of feeling insecure about their job or worrying they might leave.
So this is from academic literature that has shown that that have looked at the effectiveness of workplace policies. And so there's a study that's been done in Australia as well as another study in Canada that showed that women did not apply for leave because there was this fear. Because again, we're talking about culture. You just talked about the culture, that we think that somewhere the woman is at fault, that it's not that serious. So they're slackers who want leave, right? And so, and that therefore then the supervisor or the employer would then more likely question why they're taking the leave. So that has acted as an impediment for women to request leave. And so this has to be only addressed by having proper education. and training and policies to support women to ask for leave. So just passing the leave is not sufficient.
Sufficient. Do you know as well, in other countries, is it the way you could take it in a staggered form, or in most places is it days?
It's staggered.
Staggered.
Staggered. And it can be 1 hour.
When you need it.
Yeah, it's when you need it. It can be 1 hour, it can be a full day, it can be a half day. And that's why it's never 5 days. It's spread over.
Thank you.
Mandy, I think there was a few questions for you as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think looking at, I suppose, the most obvious way that domestic violence is affecting women's working lives at the moment is really, I suppose, losing a job is losing a way out, first and foremost, okay? So a lot of research does show that women do lose their jobs as a result of suffering domestic violence, and I think even in ICTU's own research a number of years ago, there was a lot of commentary around how women lost their jobs, and I suppose they were saying things that, like, in cases where managers are unaware or unsympathetic to the reasons for persistent lateness, unexplained absence or poor performance, employees can find themselves disciplined or even dismissed. So, I mean, losing a job and an independent source of income is a disastrous outcome for anybody suffering from domestic violence. And we know there's, well correlated documentation around vulnerability and loss of income, etc. And people who are suffering domestic violence are more, I suppose, at risk of this because of the disrupted nature of the employment, because if they're consistently losing jobs and, they're in precarious work, that the chances of them either being able to get away from their abuser or get themselves out of the situation, because the financial part of it is so important as well, that, the employer supporting, I suppose, with the policies and with the paid leave is the really big thing around that. So keeping a job is keeping a path to freedom, really. In terms of the domestic violence workplace policies and the practical supports, it's all of the things that Dr. Nata has said there. That is all of the stuff that we have. I would have plenty of examples of practical supports where we would have, no negative actions taken for poor performance, or for no negative actions taken for poor performance or for excessive absence or anything like that. So, that's in keeping with looking after people, flexible working arrangements made available, offering temporary or permanent changes in locations, in work roles if they're front-facing. A really big one as well, which came out of the ICTU survey as well, was 80% of people that were surveyed that time were abused in work during their phone or emails, so diverting their phone and emails and stuff like that. We do have salary advances in our workplace policies as well, and some of them because they're financial institutions. If there is coercive control because of their partner financially controlling them, they can, I suppose, set up separate accounts for them and things like that. So there's different things that those employments can do. We've even seen, hotel stays for 3 or 4 nights paid for by employer. That's in my own policy and work, and I think possibly in the Vodafone one as well, for somebody who is escaping a violent situation at a minute's notice. So it's ensuring that they never work alone, safety planning, all that kind of stuff. But all of this has to be in tandem with the leave. I kind of feel myself that, and I know I'm a big promoter of the actual workplace policies, I think they're a very important part of this. I kind of feel in the absence of really robust, good workplace policies where, the organisation really understands the issue, and it's talked about, and the stigma is broken slightly in the workplace. In the absence of that, I can't see people taking up paid leave, because I can't see situations where they will go to their HR managers and ask if it's not something that's in the workplace that's spoken about, or that's signposted, or that other, colleagues can talk about or show, I mean, even disclosing in the workplace. I think a lot of the research shows that people disclose to a colleague, rather than a manager or a HR partner. So it's having everybody in the workplace know about it. So that's why the policies themselves are so important as well. Thanks.
Thank you.